All right, well, in the interest of time here, I think I'll go ahead and kick us off. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined us tonight. I expect a few more. We'll keep joining as we get going, but I wanted to get us started with some introductions. So tonight we're at Building New Hampshire's Energy Future, Seeking Opportunities for Bipartisan Action. It's a panel discussion that is going to be moderated by Dr. Paul Friedrichs. He's the board chair of New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action. And he's going to be asking some questions to our panelists and moderating our discussion. So Paul, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you. Very, very happy to be here. Very excited to be here. I think we've got three great articulate panelists. You know, a question was raised, why not more? Why not more representatives from the current legislature? Well, we have an hour. If we had an hour and a half or 2 hours, we did get more people. But I think we'll have a great discussion tonight. So I wanted to introduce Tom Sherman, who, can I read from the bio if that's okay, worked hard to address many of the challenges in the Granite State as a state senator. He had a particular focus on healthcare and public health. He's a practicing and now recently retired physician. He was chair of the Senate Health and Human Services Committee, introduced legislation that recognized strong link between environmental pollution and human health. He was a leadership member of more than 15 councils, commissions, and committees. He knows the ropes about that work, including serving as chair of the Ad Hoc Emissions Commission. He continued his efforts to fully address pollution, environmental contamination, and the impacts of climate change. And as you, I hope, all aware, he was the Democratic candidate for governor last fall. Robin Tyner, Captain U.S. Navy retired, has extensive experience leading and managing diverse teams and problem solving in dynamic, fast-paced environments worldwide. She currently serves as a vice president and senior oceanographer at Sonalist, Inc. Robin comes to the fellowship with a lifelong commitment to environmental stewardship and forward-looking energy policies. She was a recent fellow at what organization? Anyway, you were a fellow. And as well as a special interest in the Arctic. She holds a BS in Physics and Oceanography from the U.S. Naval Academy, an MBA from Southern New Hampshire University, and a dual MS in Physical Oceanography and Meteorology from the Navy Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. In addition, she has completed Harvard Kennedy School programs in moral leadership and climate and energy policymaking. She serves on the board of the national nonprofit Conservatives for Responsible Stewardship and on the Exeter, New Hampshire Planning Board and Energy Committee, and was a recent candidate for the New Hampshire House from Exeter. Donald Kreis is New Hampshire's consumer advocate, very well regarded, well loved, wouldn't be too much of a stretch, tasked with the assistance of his staff with representing the interests of the Granite State's residential utility customers at the New Hampshire's Public Utilities Commission and elsewhere. They strive to keep rates as low as possible while encouraging innovation that makes consumers more powerful users of utility systems. And I am representing New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action, where I'm a member of the board. So to start off, right off the bat, Don, you've been appointed by a Democratic governor and a Republican governor to your position as consumer advocate. How have you pulled that off?
That's a great question. I'm really very proud of that fact about myself. And sometimes I find myself wondering how I've pulled that off. A glib answer will be that I try to take care to tick off the elected officials in both parties in roughly equal measure. But here's a slightly more, I think, forthright and accurate answer. I was appointed originally by Governor Hassan, and I knew Governor Hassan when she was State Senator Hassan, and I think it would be fair to say that she knew that I was sympathetic to her perspective on the issues. So, you know, basically I grew up in a Democratic family and have basically Democratic Party-esque policy preferences. And then not too soon, or not too much later after I was appointed, Chris Sununu was elected governor. Of course, he's a Republican. And I did not, I think the incoming governor and his energy people assumed that I would treat them as adversaries, and I didn't. the governor relied on a lot of young people who are relatively inexperienced in energy as his energy policy people. And I just reached out to them and offered to tell them everything I knew, which I guess I sort of did. And so right off the bat, I built decent working relationships with them. And I guess just as a person who has kind of a democratic set of personal sympathies, I really enjoy working with Republicans. It's just very rewarding to find common ground with them. And there are a lot of Republicans of goodwill in New Hampshire, and it's a pleasure to work with them.
But we look forward to hearing more about that. And we hope that you do get reappointed. You're up for a reappointment in November, I understand.
Correct. My current term expires on November 5th.
Okay. Turning to Tom and Robin, a slightly different question. In my view, building bipartisan action on New Hampshire's energy future needs to begin by acknowledging our commonalities. In this vein, I'd like to ask each of you in turn to describe what has motivated you to roll up your sleeves and work building a responsible climate crisis mitigating energy future. Tom, you want to take that first?
Sure. Well, my track record in the House and the Senate has been, I don't think anything sustainable and long-term really happens without it being bipartisan. You know, we see that in the healthcare world with Medicaid expansion. We see that in the climate world with all of the work that's been done to come up with, on net metering, come up with a solution that both parties are comfortable with and that the governor will actually sign. And what I find frustrating at that point in that regard is that every solution pretty much has been bipartisan with leaders on both sides, especially in the Senate, but also in the House. And most of those were vetoed, some of them with prime sponsors who were Republicans. So the issue is not just finding common ground in the legislature, it's finding common ground that whoever's in the corner office will be willing to sign off on, or at least not veto, which is one of the governor's options. And that has been a huge challenge because I think what we're seeing now is, number one, the evidence is very strong that whether you're looking at the rate costs, whether you're looking at the cost, for example, where I live on the seacoast, of sea level rise and increased storms and migration of fishable species in our ocean with warming here in the Gulf of Maine. When you look at those need to be addressed. And they are fiscal issues as much as they are environmental issues. And that's really where we can find a lot of common ground in coming together to address both the environmental and the fiscal issues that accompany them. And I think there's been decent success in the legislature finding those areas of common ground. And the frustration has been that many of those, and I'm not running for anything at this point. So the frustration has been, and the veto record shows it, that this governor has really vetoed many of those, and the vast majority were bipartisan.
Thank you. Robin, what has made you a conservative for conservation and for a livable climate future?
I think in the beginning, you don't even think about that. You know, if you're a kid and you're interested in things and you grow up and you love being outside, you grow up in the country and you love the environment, nobody's thinking about politics at that stage. It's just what's around you and what you love and what you value. And grew up around people who value that. And, you know, I've lived in a lot of places. I've moved 14 times in, 32 and a half years. And my hometown area, just for a frame of reference, Trump won by 42%. I live in Exeter, where it's probably the exact opposite. It's just the other end of the spectrum. But guess what? Everybody loves their kids. Everybody loves their dogs. Everybody likes trees and gardens and all those same things, right? So it's a lot of time, I really think there's a lot of just marketing going on to make people think the other guy's evil, right? So if you just focus on the problem at hand, and I guess the other part of me is, I have a scientific background and a military background. Military used to be, you weren't really allowed to be partisan. There's this Hatch Act and all this stuff. You can't influence people and talk about the politics. And as a scientist, it's more about the facts and what's in the studies, what's in the journals. And maybe the hardest lesson for me is that other people aren't motivated by facts and as much as I am, per se, but there's the emotional thing, which I don't know. I just like the facts, but when you just follow that, there's a problem that is, it's undeniable. It's not a model. It's not a suggestion. It's not a theory. It's measured and observed for decades. So we know this, and there's broad agreement on that. But that doesn't mean there's only one set of solutions. And if you don't pick those solutions, then you're evil and you don't acknowledge the problem. And so sometimes I think the marketing devolves things down into that. And so if we could just all, like follow all the rules we're supposed to have learned in kindergarten and talk about a solution set and, have some discussions, I think we could get there if everybody's in the place of wanting to solve the problem. And there have been some efforts along those lines. And at local scales, in Congress, we had the climate caucus going for a while. I say that the organization I have, maybe just as one example, there was a bill in Arizona just within the state, and they're getting gas piped in from another state, and it's costing them, a bunch of money. And then, there was a Democratic bill, and they wanted to do all the solar stuff without getting into the details of it, which doesn't really matter for the story. But and because of the Democrat bill, the Republicans opposed it. And, if it was the opposite way, it probably would have been the opposite thing, because people just get told the other side's bad. So Democrat bill, so all the Republicans opposed it, and it didn't make it. And then, our group looked at it, and it was actually a pretty good bill, and you can make a really sound economic case for the state of Arizona and solar power. And so we just went in and talked to all these state legislatures and said, well, here's the economics behind it and the science, and it just makes sense. And the protection, you're not getting energy from out of state, it's right here. And same bill the next year passed almost unanimously. And so part of it is just talking to people, and reaching them and where the values are, I think.
Well, that's certainly the goal of New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action as trusted messengers to get information out, to get facts out. I think most of New Hampshire's residents love our environment, want to keep it a healthy one, and we want to get the facts out about our changing environment and changing health challenges in New Hampshire from climate change. We use lots of graphs and facts and figures in our community presentations and try to get those facts out there with the basis of loving what we have and not wanting to lose it. Thank you. Robin, we're going to sort of go in reverse order. Next question, if you wanted to start on this one. Personal freedom is a strong driver for New Hampshire conservatives. Can you address how the principles of personal freedom and freedom of opportunity can bring us together on issues as diverse as community power purchasing, net metering, opportunities for small generators of solar and wind energy, and opportunities for transactional energy trading to and from EV and home battery storage?
I guess I think all those things are consistent with personal freedom, because if you have personal freedom, you have the choice to do all of those things, or your communities, can choose to do those things. And I know when a lot of actually, I think Tom Sherman, you mentioned bills that had been vetoed by the governor. I think there was one, maybe not this session, but in the past, I might forget which year, but recently, in the recent past, that there was a lot of Republican legislatures that were in favor of a lot of this community power because they saw the benefits for the community. And I think there was a bill that got vetoed, but it, like you said, it had bipartisan support because, you know, as a community, they're free to look at what it does the best fit for our community. And I think the same thing with individuals as well, as long as you're not, you know, harming someone else. But I definitely think that across the board. I mean, I just think that for, you know, just for my health care or, you know, medical stuff, medical freedom, all of that. And I guess maybe I'm not answering that very well, but I guess I don't see any inconsistency between personal freedom and choosing. I have an electric car sitting in your driveway right now. So just because I chose to do that. I don't think everybody else should be forced to do that, but it made sense for me in my life where I'm commuting, where, you know, I don't want to pay for all this gas anyway. And it's really nice and quiet to listen to things when I'm driving. You know, so there's, yeah, I just really believe in choice, and then you can educate people and have discussions with people. And
But you see that as good common ground where liberals can talk to conservatives and both get behind these programs that are transformative for our grid and our economy and a clean energy future, but get both sides of the aisle supporting.
We can, but I think we have to not dumb them down to that you have to do this or you're bad, or you do this, because I don't think that I'm great in doing great things because I have an electric car, because I also know that it depends how that's being fueled and what else happened along the way. And there are issues with batteries and rare earth minerals and mining, and all those things are legitimate issues. And what's the grid if everybody had one, where we're not there yet? So, which is another reason to just be kind of anti-mandate. But because those issues are real, from the other hand, doesn't mean they're insurmountable, and doesn't mean you don't go forward. So that's where there's just got to be, you know, continued dialogue. There's no perfect solution. It's just, you know, working to get there.
Tom, how about you? Is this an opportunity for common ground?
Absolutely. And I agree with Robin. I think that right now, the freedom of people to develop projects, whether it's solar, wind, hydro, is hugely restricted in the state of New Hampshire by the cap. There is now some exception to the 5 megawatt cap on net metering. But one great example is there's one of our larger and certainly more international employers is a manufacturing plant up in the North Country that I visited, and they had, when I talked to the CEO about their costs, energy was by far their highest cost, higher than medical, higher than healthcare, it was energy. They have the capacity to, both in land for solar or possibly hydro even, because of the position of the Ammonoosuc River, they could potentially tap into one or both of those sources, but they're a 5-day-a-week operation. They could fully utilize 3 to 4 megawatts of power coming out in, you know, for their 5-day-a-week operation, but they are capped because for them to actually make sense financially, they would need to go beyond the current cap on their ability to generate their own energy. If they were able to go beyond the cap that they are currently facing, they could actually sell back into the grid and make the whole development of the project workable, and also be able to provide renewable power to the region at some level. And that is, you know, in the live free or die state, not being able to have the freedom to develop a project like that is intensely frustrating. And on the personal level, I think community power is a phenomenal example of bipartisan policy coming to fruition. But net metering is an example of limitations on the ability of individuals, communities, and actual businesses to cut their costs and provide a benefit to their community, and that's frustrating. But just one additional point to that: every bit of this movement towards upping the cap to 5 megawatts across the board was bipartisan. And so it is an example where both parties, leaders on both sides of the aisle and the legislature, came together to really provide a solution that was best for New Hampshire. And unfortunately, it didn't make it through.
Don, do you have any comments about these initiatives or on how they impact the ratepayer?
Remember at the beginning, I said that my secret was sort of ticking off both sides in equal measure. My answer to your question is going to be an example of that. But let me first say, I think that there are certain energy initiatives that are stellar examples of promoting the kind of autonomy and freedom of choice that we revere in the live free or die state. And one of those is transactive energy. And that proposition is pretty simple, right? Like, we have an open market in electricity at wholesale here in New England, but we don't have an open market for electricity at retail. Right now, if Tom is producing energy, in his back 40, and I live next door to him and I need some energy, he can't sell it to me directly. And a transactive energy platform would give him, if he were my neighbor, the ability to do that. And it actually would give him the ability to combine what he can produce with other people and maybe sell it to a whole bunch of us people. So it would open up the retail exchange of energy in a way that I find really exciting. As far as community power aggregation goes, we are really into local control in New Hampshire, right? So when Congress doesn't pursue enlightened energy policy, the responsibility devolves to the states. And when the states don't do what's right on energy policy, then the onus and the torch is passed to local governments. And community power aggregation is an opportunity for every community in New Hampshire to step up and decide what kind of an energy community does it want to be. That's really exciting. Now, here's where I'm going to start ticking people off. Here's my glib analysis of net metering. I do not agree with my friend Tom Sherman that there are any restrictions on anybody's ability to develop solar installations, at their business or anyplace else. If you want to build a 4 megawatt solar array on the roof of your factory, you can do that, and you can sell your power at wholesale through the ISO New England wholesale market, just like anybody else. When we talk about net metering, we're talking about a subsidy that's provided to net metering customers for public policy reasons. Net metering started by accident in Quincy, Massachusetts, back in the 1970s. Some guy decided to see if it would spin the meter backwards if he plugged his solar panels right into the grid, and it turned out he was right. But the fact remains that net metering is a special gift to people that are allowed to do it. And the political and practical reality of net metering in New Hampshire is this. Governor Sununu has a deep-seated dislike of the solar industry, and so he vetoes net metering bills, but the Democratic caucus in the legislature follows the instructions of the solar industry, and for some reason it has convinced itself that whatever is good for solar is good for America. And those two positions are incompatible. So I say, that's a stupid fight. Let's stop having it. Governor Sununu vetoed all the net metering bills in 2019, which is the last time the Democrats were in charge, but he signed the community power aggregation bill, and he signed the data platform bill that I wrote. That's because we stopped talking about net metering and moved on to stuff that promotes freedom.
Okay, Tom, you can respond, and then Robin.
Yeah, I respectfully disagree. I am aware that anybody anywhere could go and create 4 megawatts of power, and the reality is that is financially not doable without the support of net metering for many of these smaller companies. And the benefit, of course, even though you didn't talk about this, Don, the benefit is to the community for that renewable energy. And one other correction to the record is that it was not just the Democratic caucus. It was strongly bipartisan with leadership in both parties. Since I was a member of the caucus, I recall that well. So we will, of course, respectfully disagree, but that is the way I see the importance of net metering.
Well, I agree with Senator Sherman that the New Hampshire Senate is a veritable garden of bipartisanship. Seriously, the two caucuses work together really well. And,
it's got a few weeds there, but it is a veritable garden. Yeah.
Well, on energy issues.
Well, we could move on, or Robin, do you want to add any more comments, or should we move on?
No, I think you can move on.
Okay. Speaking of an area where not everybody can produce their energy and sell it into the grid, I don't know what happened with the vote on House Bill 281 today. Does anybody know what happened?
Yeah, and it's going to a committee of conference.
So it did not pass the House. It went, okay.
To a committee.
And are people thinking it's going to pass? Anyway.
I think yeah, no one knows for sure.
Okay. So, yes, this was yesterday. House Bill 281 does several things. It repeals the least cost integrated resource plans with the Public Utility Commission. It removes requirement that municipal host act in conjunction with the same municipality and all the group members. Does cost of electric renewables on your electric bills. Repeals Energy Efficiency Sustainability Energy Board and changes the site evaluation committee process. But to make a long story short, in yesterday's New Hampshire Business Review, the Democratic mayor of Nashua, Jim Donchis, and the Republican mayor of Keene, George Hansel, put together an opinion piece urging the passage of that bill because they want the part where their cities can get together with the neighboring town or city and use that geography, which is not rich in dense cities, but is richer in more rural surrounding towns, to have energy fields produce energy and feed it into the grid. They admitted in the report that although the bill is far from perfect and also includes a regulatory measure that could stifle progress on utility energy planning, we know from experience that politics is the art of the possible. The evidence is clear that House Bill 281 will do far more good than harm for our state's environment and economy. Let's take this opportunity to expand energy independence for New Hampshire cities and towns while offsetting hundreds of millions of pounds of carbon pollution every year for decades to come. So this is our current version of compromise. It sounds like it's will be favorable. I think that Governor Sununu, my understanding, is in charge of these. Is this a workable, good compromise, or is this bad sausage? Anybody want to jump in or comment? Or?
Well, I guess maybe I should leap in. House Bill 281, as it was passed in the House, simply repealed the least cost integrated resource planning statute. And before the bill was voted on the House, I spoke out very emphatically against the bill. Then over in the Senate, the bill was amended to include a bunch of other provisions. It was a deal struck amongst Senator Waters in the Senate, who's a Democrat, Representative Vose, who's a Republican, who chairs the House Science, Technology, and Energy Committee. And I'm told that the governor favors the bill. And as I said, when I testified about the bill in the Senate, as a state employee, it doesn't behoove me to attempt to interfere with a bargain like that was struck across the two houses and the two of the three branches of government. And so I guess I am neutral about the fate of that particular bill.
Okay. Well, we'll see. You're welcome to make any comments, Robin or Tom, or we can move on to the next question.
The only comment that I would make is that the structure of a committee of conference, and I've served on many of these, it's there is a huge possibility and a probability that differences can be worked out in the committee of conference, especially if they are not huge. If they're very close but not close enough, some of the concerns that Don mentioned, I think, are concerns of the Democratic caucus in the House. But as he said, this is already somewhat of a compromise, and it may just need some tweaking to get enough support to be able to pass both chambers. So I would not, it's frustrating for a lot of people, but there is a possibility that the final compromise that comes out of a committee of conference and goes back to both chambers would be actually a better bill than the one that came before the House.
Right. I'd like to move on to what I think is the central question of this conversation, at least for me, which is looking at the cost of energy, the cost of energy we do now, what's the cheapest to buy today, versus the cost to us, to our environment, to our built environment, to our health in the next decade and 20 years and 30 years in terms of sustainability. The public face about energy policy is all about the cost to the ratepayer. In the debate about costs, how can we get the New Hampshire executive and legislature to start including external costs of our energy sourcing, such as the cost savings of renewables investments over time, the cost of the adverse health impact of continued fossil fuel use, which is tremendous, the huge cost of recovery from climate change generated catastrophic weather events, and the huge costs of preemptive infrastructure adaptation. The New Hampshire Department of Transportation is investing in new bridges along the seacoast in anticipation of extreme weather and sea level rise as one example of that. But we're not factoring that into the long-term cost of our energy solution. Is there an answer to this?
I think it's just.
Oh, go ahead, Robin. Sorry. No, go ahead.
I mean, I think it has to come from the people demanding that we have some honest accounting of these things, because it's really easy with all of these topics. You could probably find the right numbers and the right statistics, and they'd all be true and make any case you wanted depending on what you include and how end-to-end your analysis is, which I think is part of the problem you're getting at, is there's things we're not including, or some groups are maybe not including that are, other costs, if it's environmental costs and health costs, which is, I mean, it's sort of like we saw with the Northern Pass, where no one wanted to consider all the environmental costs, and finally we did. And but I think just maybe just like the Northern Pass, the people have to be involved enough to demand that we do a full accounting of these things. I guess I'm also been in government long enough, and not to offend Donald, but long enough to know that I don't necessarily trust any government, where I've spent most of my life in it or working within it. Just because it's everything's, there's human beings involved, and so it's not a perfect person, a perfect answer. That's always worth looking and saying, hey, how come you didn't consider the fact that we're going to have to replace this bridge in 10 years or whatever. We did a review on the Energy Committee in Exeter when they were proposing a gas pipeline to come through. And so our committee, we had a 3-committee, there's 3 of us, and kind of went to the U.S. Department of Energy website and looked at, the costs and the numbers they use, the statistics they use for things. And we kind of did if this is supposed to have a lifetime of 40 years versus there's this infrastructure that's lacking, and here's the bill for the infrastructure. And we just went through and tried to do an honest review of all the costs, and we came out opposed to it. But we could really document why, and we felt comfortable that we had done a pretty solid analysis. So if someone questioned us on it, we could kind of go toe to toe. No, we did include this, and we included that. And a lot of it is people just have to be involved.
Any other responses to this?
Yeah, I think that this is really a really great example of this is the health impacts. You know, the health impacts of both climate change, but also of the actual pollutants that are driving some of that. For example, as chair of the Emissions Commission, we had an incredible presentation from Katie Bush at the Department of Health and Human Services that talked about the impact on asthma, respiratory illness like COPD, cardiac illness, but then an enormous impact of actual warming is tick-borne and vector-borne illness, which is exploding in the state of New Hampshire. Not just affecting humans, but our moose population and others, direct impact of warming. So one is the impact of the way we create energy, which is particulates, and the largest, following Katie's presentation, was from the Department of Environmental Services talking about particulates. And while some of the energy production has actually shifted, the transportation corridor is really where we're seeing so much of the particulate emissions that are impacting both our climate, but also our health. And so when you think about nonpartisan, because we're all touched by these, you think about health, we're all touched by this. I don't know many families in New Hampshire who have not seen some impact, whether it's respiratory, cardiac, or vector-borne illness like tick, the diseases that are borne by ticks. And also, as we see increased numbers of hot days, Katie talked about the impact of high heat index on mortality and ED visits. That means emergency department visits, and actually used Nashua as an example of the increase. If we don't make changes now, by the end of this century, we're looking at a 55-fold increase in emergency department visits over what was there 10 years ago, just based on heat index changes. So these are compelling, ubiquitous. They impact everybody. And I agree completely with Robin that we have to be the drivers as the voters. We have to be the drivers of the response that will protect the health and all the other indirect costs of climate on the people of New Hampshire.
Don, can you foresee a day where the New Hampshire PUC or ISO New England seriously factors in the external costs of climate change, or for that matter, even the costs saved in spending a little more money on efficient appliances, efficient lighting, and better insulation?
Well, can I foresee that day? Yes, I can. Let me give you a ratepayer advocate gloss on this issue, because it's a little different. My agenda, my statute doesn't overtly tell me to be an environmental advocate. So I care about ratepayers. And I guess Tom Sherman is a physician. He will appreciate that if I take a pill that avoids a heart attack tonight, that's more valuable than taking a pill that will avoid a heart attack 10 years from now. So you have to figure out some way to compare the value.
They're both good, John.
They are both good, but that 10-year, that distant benefit 10 years from now is less valuable to me now than something that benefits me 5 minutes from now. So how do you compare those two things? Well, you have to apply a discount rate. So the question for me as a ratepayer advocate is, obviously we would like there to continue to be civilization on planet Earth, 10 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now. What is the net present value of civilization continuing to exist 1,000 years from now? I think we need to come up with an answer. It turns out it's really subjective. You can make up any number you want to reduce that to a net present value. And so it's a value judgment. I'm really intrigued by the conservative economist Tyler Cowan, C-O-W-A-N, because he has written a lot about discount rates. And now remember, he's a free market conservative. He advocates using a discount rate of 0 to bring the value of future civilization to its net present value. That means that we would do whatever we can to make sure that civilization persists. That is a very radical proposition coming from the pen of a conservative Republican economist. So as citizens, we have to be thinking about stuff like discount rates. My motto is simplify and sensationalize. So I'm ready to give a talk about discount rates anytime anybody wants.
If I could just go back to Don's medical model, we know that something that will, a response to a heart attack tomorrow is much more expensive than behavior modification and all the other interventions for prevention of that heart attack 10 years from now. We've done that modeling, and it's not fuzzy math, as Robin as a scientist knows, and most of the physicians, all of the physicians on this call are scientists. We know the cost savings from prevention, and I would say that there is a significant parallel, and that's when you look at efficiency and the current PUC continues to target efficiency projects, not target them to enhance them, but to actually take away the support for them. And in my world, that would be like telling insurance companies, you no longer have to cover a screening colonoscopy. And we know the cost benefit of doing that screening. And we know that efficiency is probably enhancing efficiency for energy is one of the cheapest interventions there is, because and Don, you may disagree with that, but it is maybe you don't, which is great.
He fought for it. He fought hard for it. Yeah.
No, to the contrary, I think, first of all, as the founder of the Comfortable Colonoscopy Coalition, I just commend anybody that promotes colonoscopies. But more to the point, though, we have ratepayer-funded energy efficiency. This goes exactly to the point I was making before. The PUC favors a really high discount rate to take a stream of long-term benefits from energy efficiency and bringing them to their net present value. The PUC would use the utility weighted average cost of capital. Well, that's about 7%. Not very much energy efficiency looks cost effective with a discount rate of 7% over 30 years of benefits. But if you use a 2% discount rate, which is the one I favor, then energy efficiency looks really good. I think that's the right answer.
And that's all in the numbers. But I think one other thing important in this discussion, it's important to make sure we've considered all of the indirect costs, but it also means doing that right, because there's a lot of things that drive me nuts in a little ways. I first qualified as a hurricane and typhoon forecaster in 1991. And, we've known all about El Nino, and all of a sudden it's all over the news. Oh my God, El Nino's coming. Well, we've known about that forever, and the cycles and what happens with it. And so things get sensationalized. And if that's not your field and not something you knew about, sometimes, the media marketing is to, get clicks and drive people one direction or the other, or one extreme or the other. So we had huge hurricanes 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and they had devastating impacts. And the conditions are right for them to, I'm just using this as an example, that larger areas of water get warmer, stay warmer longer, and that's fuel for hurricanes and all of that. And that's true. But you can't go so far as when you have a hurricane, we had the hurricane because of climate change, because now you're being disingenuous. And none of us really know how to measure for a specific event. Would this one have been a category 2 instead of a category 3? Or, those types of things. We're just not that good. And so a lot of the numbers that you can use are, again, more long-term averages or seasonal averages and things like that. And so it's just I guess getting into the people who deal with numbers and science and stuff, it's to try to make sure your arguments are found and that we don't go off and just villainize something or have a single cause, or even to your healthcare concerns, with the rising healthcare concerns. How many, are heat index versus increasing use of glyphosate or chemicals or other things, and how do you differentiate between different causes of people having more respiratory, and I don't know this because I'm not a medical person, but respiratory problems or cancers or whatever the case is, because there's a lot of other things happening in our environment that we have to consider, and sometimes we don't know which thing is the biggest villain, and is it a 10% factor or 20% factor or 50% factor?
Right.
Good point. Let's try to make sure our facts are facts. I'd like to get on to two questions more before we open it up to the general audience, but we'll have to make them quick answers, I guess. One government institution that has acknowledged climate change and has for some time is the U.S. Department of Defense, which for some time has identified climate change as a critical national security issue. Acknowledging that it will amplify operational demands on the force, degrade installations and infrastructure resilience, and increase health risks to our service members. That was a DoD report from 2022, but their preparations for climate change, I think, has gone back long before that. Mm-hmm. Robin, starting with you, what allowed the Department of Defense to become early acceptors of climate change as a reality?
I did a presentation at EarthX in Dallas back in 2018 on this, and I wish I could have found that slide, but it was an old hard drive somewhere. But I want to say it goes back to probably the mid 2000s. And I know for the Navy, I was working in the position in the Pentagon where I controlled all the decision briefs that went to the Chief of Naval Operations. And so we had some people working on what became Task Force Climate Change. And because I own that schedule and I decided, we got to do, oh my God, the anti-submarine warfare community needs to rebuild this thing, or we got to look at the, the re-enlistment bonuses for the nuclear guys because they're all leaving, or, whatever the crisis issue was. Because I controlled that agenda, and everyone say, kick that stupid weather thing off of there so we can, get this other important, war fighting thing. And I was able to protect that so we could have the discussion. And so that was, I think, 2008. And so we basically, the decision that came out of this meeting is we're going to create this task force climate change, which was really about doing research into the impacts. And then we also had task force energy. And then shortly, like the next year, we did an Arctic roadmap. And then a few years later, from the Office of Naval Research, I ended up briefing at the Task Force Climate Change. But it was and interesting when it was set up. You had people that were cheering for it, and people were like, "What are we doing?" And we had to. There was a tendency to go give that to the weather guys to take care of. And I think my position to my boss, who ran the Navy staff, and I was like the engine operator, was no, don't give it to the weather guys, which had been my own field. And my own admiral was mad at me because I didn't give it to our community to take care of. I said, this needs to go to the operations and policy people. There needs to be ops and policy. And that's where it went. And he, had some, bloody drag down fights to force them to take it. And I had to shepherd the meetings at first where people resented being there. But what's really cool to see is a couple of years down the road, everyone's excited to be there, because once you start looking into the impacts, where it really hit for the military and where you can really make a case is not, hey, we're going to go fix climate for climate's sake, but we care, we want to operate worldwide. We want to be able to operate our systems, operate, weapon systems. We want to be able to put people in if we want to retrieve people and get them out safely. And all of those things really depend on having good weather forecasts and predictions and models of when we can use things, whether it's too cloudy or too rainy or too windy or, and so you have to have good forecast models. And what's happening with the global forecast models is a lot of the global models are initialized by regional models. And so the Arctic becomes really important because the Arctic models is a regional models, and they kick off the global models that all these things are depending on. And the Arctic is changing so fast that from the time you study something, you set up a research project and you set things up and you do all the studies and then you write the papers, and that can take, 3, 4, 5 years. And what was happening is by the time all the papers come out and get published, things have already changed again. And so cycles were changing so fast that in the end, you can really draw a direct correlation to the safety of people and the efficient operation of all these, mega $1 million systems. And you can, justify that and document that and show that. And so I think that's gotten a lot of interest. And then there's things like that are really obvious to anybody without doing all the research, like Norfolk Naval Base, which I've been stationed there like 3 times, I guess. And that's the largest naval base in the world. And that's one of the most impacted places, because places are impacted equally. Norfolk's, the impacts are huge, way worse than like Portsmouth, but it doesn't mean they're not. It's just, there's not equal impacts anywhere. And so they're having to go in and do things like raise piers, and there's roads and parking lots that flood in a thunderstorm. So when you have a tropical storm come through, it shuts it down. So I think those just from the Navy side, and there's other things. I know there's an Army gal. She lives in Vermont and she commutes to DC, and she's been doing the Army climate thing for probably 5 or maybe longer, probably 8 years now. So the Army's got a climate person too, and for the same types of reasons.
So just to quickly wrap things up, we sort of can't end without at least mentioning the bipartisan support for a carbon tax and dividend and that opportunity. This year, New Hampshire House Bill 372 proposed to establish a commission to study the short and long-term impacts of pending national and regional carbon pricing on New Hampshire's citizens, businesses, institutions, and environment. That's all wordage from the bill. But it was voted inexpedient to legislate. Quick thumbs up, thumbs down, or I'm staying neutral. Do you support carbon pricing implementation? And is there a role for more state level discussion of carbon tax and revenue distribution? Or is this simply a discussion and implementation at the national level?
I don't know if John wants to take that, or I'll just say that these commissions are incredibly valuable, having served on a bajillion of them, in terms of making us smarter. Having a commission should not be a threat and should not be inexpedient to legislate. Having a commission to determine whether something is appropriate for the state of New Hampshire is the way we get smarter. So whether that commission, that's the way we started with Medicaid expansion. I was on that commission. That's the way we've started with all sorts of policy. Sometimes the commissions find that no, it's appropriate for it to be a federal level policy. And sometimes they find that it needs to be regional, and it starts the discussion with neighboring states. But forming a commission about a topic should not be a threat and should not be something that I think we put the kibosh on, unless there's consensus that it's not appropriate for the state.
Okay. Robin, do you have any comments quickly?
Yeah, I don't think there's a problem with commission to talk about it. I have been to, there's a national one that exists, a carbon pricing meeting that they would have quarterly meetings that got a little disrupted through 2020 and 21, but it was actually it still exists, Chatham House Rules, and it had people from all parties. There'd usually be somebody from Congress or Senate, or at least some powerful staff positions, and they're really working this, and it was a good forum with think tanks and environmental groups, but it was all Chatham House rules, so I can't talk about it. But there are people working that at the federal level, and so I would think if there is a commission here, it would be great if they were able to tap into that.
Don, I understand you have a hard stop at 7 and we're only 4 or 5 minutes away. Do you have any additional comments, or we can ask a question from the audience?
Well, let me just say there is a very lively study commission that's looking at the future of nuclear power. And it is kind of too bad that there wasn't a similar group studying a carbon fee and dividend, even though I think in order to be implemented, it would have to be a federal program. But as Tom Sherman mentioned, the way we get to great national initiatives is by talking about them at all levels. So I think it's kind of a shame that didn't go forward.
I think there is an argument to get New Hampshire businesses ready, because Europe, for example, is going ahead and Canada is going ahead with their carbon pricing systems, and we want our businesses to be able to compete as well.
Right, because of the border adjustment mechanisms that are going to get implemented around the planet. Yeah, these are important questions that should be studied.
So I want to open up to the audience. I'm sorry, there was just so much to talk about tonight. Donna, if you need to leave at 7, we certainly understand. Anybody else who can stay on? Patsy, you had a question. Do you want to come on and ask it, or shall I read it?
Yeah, I can ask it. I saw this report in Massachusetts, and I tell people about it a lot, but I'm always wondering if there's something similar in New Hampshire that shows the impacts of green investments on public health. And, I just don't know if the air in Massachusetts would be dirtier overall and we wouldn't have that effect in New Hampshire, or if people think it would be similar.
I can just jump on that for a second, Patsy. There was a study done in Rhode Island, and Katie Bush was a part of it, and it looked at health outcomes as a result of RGGI, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and it showed enormous benefits, not just for the RGGI states on public health, but for the neighboring states. So the border states that were not a part of RGGI actually benefited from that. So there are other, there is quantifiable, objective science behind the idea that the impact of doing something, and in that case it was RGGI, will have a positive predictor on decreasing benefit for public health.
Thank you. And I did find a study that showed that carbon fee and dividend actually has better health effects, a little bit better than RGGI. So I think it was a Midwestern state.
Right.
Thanks.
Did you want to comment?
So, Tom, I agree with you on the RGGI one. The one thing I worry about with Massachusetts is because they have this whole green energy need to get more energy and the solicitation out. And the reason we saw Northern Pass and CMP corridors now such an issue in Maine is how they define green energy. And so that's another one of these examples of the devil's in the details, where it might be great for Massachusetts, but was it really worth destroying 14 pristine native brook trout streams and dividing the largest roadless area left east of the Mississippi and flooding native Indian tribal lands in Canada? And, where 2 foreign companies partner and profit from it. So, that's another one where there's all these indirect effects that are huge and that matter. And it doesn't mean that there's not a value to green energy. It certainly doesn't mean that, but how you get it matters. And it just, when I hear Massachusetts, I just think about that. Yeah.
Right, and there are other Massachusetts programs that I think we can do a better job on, and some of depending on the focus of the program, for example, efficiency, we might want to look at models in Vermont and Maine rather than Massachusetts.
Right.
And so I agree completely. The devil's in the detail, and it also, there, you know, these, in medicine we call them subspecialties, but these niche, or not niche, but these focus areas of how we approach our energy policy. And I don't know if Don could weigh in, but I think there are clearly, you don't want to just assume that one state has the best model for each one. You probably want to be looking for where it has been most effective for the consumer. Would that be correct, Don?
Yes, absolutely. You know, you mentioned efficiency and you talked about Maine and Vermont. I think we should think about Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, they are the second ranked state in the country when it comes to energy efficiency. The utilities deliver energy efficiency programs in that state. We have the same utilities as they do. And here in New Hampshire, we're like number 22 or something like that. So it's the same people at the same companies. What's the difference? The public policy support for energy efficiency is strong in New Hampshire. It's weak it's strong in Massachusetts. I mean, it's weak in New Hampshire, and that should change.
Well, it's nice to hear a lot of agreement tonight, more agreement than disagreement, I think. For the last 60 seconds before we have to sign off, everybody gets 15 seconds to say what they'd love to see happen within the next 5 years. I will start. I'd love to see a grid developed that is flexible and allow transactional energies and contributions on the retail and wholesale level from clean energy producers other than the major current energy power plants, and so to be grid ready for the rest of the 21st century. Tom?
I'd like to see that residents, the citizens, could say in New Hampshire, our energy initiatives are, and in New Hampshire, we do, and we work towards a cleaner environment by. I think the only when I've spoken to people, I'm come across as an eco-theologian and very concerned about creation. But what most people would say, some people recycle. That's the answer I get. The rich can have solar. You know.
Well, that's a really good point. I would like to see the ability for anyone who's interested in the state of New Hampshire to access technology that can decrease their carbon impact and that have that freedom to do so. And I think that will take a recognition of the majority of the legislature from both parties that there clearly is an imperative here, and that imperative, with the medical background starts at a public health level, but it's also living right on the seacoast, seeing climate change, seeing sea level rise, seeing the impact of these storms, and recognizing that doing nothing or not doing enough is going to have a huge impact on our future and on our children's future.
Robin, do you have a five-year wish?
There's more attention being paid all over the world, and some of it's great, and some of it honestly really angers me because I think the focus needs to be a lot on the biggest bang for the buck on how to solve the problem without harming people. And there are a lot of initiatives out there that are just running over people and not necessarily giving you the biggest bang for the buck. There's so many things to do with efficiency or building codes in New Hampshire and just making the conversion off of fossil fuels itself. But some of the things going after farmers and when you hear some of the gas stove things, I mean, there's a lot of things that are really hurting. You're kicking people when they're down with. And I don't think they always focus on the biggest problems. I mean, to me, honestly, I would love to see a war on plastics because the plastics in the environment is huge, in the ocean is huge. It's in all of us are eating it all the time. It's in every food, and you use oil to make plastics. That's a huge fossil fuel thing, and it's not cool and sexy. It doesn't get talked about, but to me, that would be one of the biggest difference makers, and not only for climate, but for so many other things in the environment. So,
Don, how about you? Any 5-year wish for the ratepayers in New Hampshire?
Absolutely. The ultimate carbon-free fuel is energy efficiency. It produces zero carbon. And from a ratepayer impact perspective, financially, Amory Lovins, the great Amory Lovins, has called energy efficiency the lunch you get paid to eat. So therefore, I would go after all cost-effective energy efficiency. Unfortunately, that's a hard sell with Republicans because it is a transgression on the sort of free market economics. But that's my dream.
Well, I just turned off my light, Don. Thanks very much. And I'm going to soon be turning off our computer. I think that uses up our time. I would just encourage those out there to join us at New Hampshire Healthcare Climate Workers for New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action. Become a member today. Only $10 a year membership fee. Getting ready to invited to a great summer party next month. Check us out. Check out our website if you haven't already. And thanks for joining us tonight. Emily, do you have any other final words?
No, just thank you so much to our speakers.